Hey, looks like I finally got my skin to work. But anyway, so today I today I want to talk about the Ship of Theseus, which is a thought experiment. Oh wait, I should probably put my armor back on. So the Ship of Theseus is a thought experiment that has been around for a very long time, since ancient Greece, in fact. And the idea of the thought experiment is basically you have a ship, right? The ship of Theseus. Theseus being a character in Greek mythology who fought the Minotaur and all that. But that's beside the point for now. The ship is built out of wood naturally, and the way the experiment goes is this: the ship gradually has to undergo repairs, right? But to undergo repairs, you have to replace certain parts of the ship. Problem is that you have to keep replacing things. You have to keep replacing them. Have to keep replacing more and more stuff until eventually you get to a point where none of the original parts of the ship are actually the same. Like, none of the original parts of the ship remain from before. So the ship hasn't changed in that the ship is still the ship. You just kept replacing parts of it to repair it. But what happened is you kept replacing more and more parts until eventually none of the parts of the original ship are still present. You've thrown all of them away. All of the parts are new. Now, of course, this begs the question: is this the same Ship of Theseus? Because you could say that yes, it's the same ship, but at the same time, it's not the same. None of them are the same parts, are they? What is happening? Why are there so many? Too many. What is happening? Of course, the question from a purely literal standpoint makes not very much sense, since at the end of the day, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to try and completely replace every single part of the ship, since some parts are not practical to replace or borderline impossible even. But regardless, we're not here to look at it from a literal standpoint. We're here to look at it from a more philosophical standpoint. Okay, this is an interesting duel. Oh man, I mean, maybe it was too ambitious, but I was hoping I could get maybe a music disc. Skeletons are never doing anything right, are they? Okay, I'm supposed to be doing a video where I'm talking about really important things right now. How am I supposed to focus when... to be honest, it's kind of my fault for, like, trying to do this in a cave. I mean, it should be common sense that this is a bad idea. But anyway, let's try and be a little more focused. So the question is this the same Ship of Theseus? And the question is made even more complex by the fact that we can introduce another element of complexity to it, which is, now let's imagine that the wood used in the original ship, the wood that has been replaced, has now been used to construct an entirely new ship. Now we have two ships: the original ship, which is made out of the wood that has been used to replace the old wood, and the new ship that has been made with the old wood. Now the question is, which of them is truly the Ship of Theseus? And it's genuinely a difficult question. It's not very easy to say with complete certainty which answer is true. Is it the old ship? Is it the new ship? Or is it both? Or is it even neither? Now, for the sake of ease of communication, let's call them ship number 1 and ship number 2. Ship number 1 being the original ship, which has now been made, which is now made of wood that's the new wood, the replacement wood, and ship number 2, which is made out of the old wood, the new ship made out of the original wood that used to make up the previous ship. So ship number 1, ship number 2. Now, of course, we could say that, in fact, no, ship number 1 is not the Ship of Theseus. Why? Because, well, it's not at all made up of the same parts that used to make up the Ship of Theseus. Thus, to say that it's the Ship of Theseus is to say that something completely different is now the Ship of Theseus. In other words, we're linking the whole of the ship to its parts. It is not independent of its parts. Each parts of the ship are a necessary component of the ship, and without its parts, the ship cannot be said to be the same. It is fundamentally different because it's made up of different parts. Now, of course, this approach leads us to some interesting conclusions. For example, if we consider this to be true, it would lead us to necessarily accept the fact that the parts are, in fact, all that really exists, right? Because here's the thing: if the whole doesn't matter so long as the parts are different, then what you're saying is that the whole is inconsequential. The whole doesn't even really exist. The whole only exists as a collective, a collection of parts. And so when the parts change, the whole simply ceases to be. It does not have the parts necessary to sustain it. And to have different parts would mean having to accept the fact that a new whole has come to be. In other words, there's no such thing as a ship. Why? Because if there was a ship, the ship would continue to exist no matter what. But because we have linked the existence of the ship to the existence of the parts that make it up, then we have implicitly accepted that the ship is worthless and, in fact, completely meaningless without its parts. Ergo, we could go so far as to say that the ship doesn't exist. The idea being that the ship, because it's only a collection of parts, aka the pieces of wood that make it up, the ship only exists as a sort of linguistic convenience. The word ship doesn't really mean anything. It's only a way for us to identify a certain set of pieces of wood assembled in a certain way, instead of having to say the keel and the prow and the figurehead and whatever else. You could simply say the ship. Oh, diamonds. Of course, this may be a slight exaggeration of the conclusions that we can come to from this, but these are definitely plausible conclusions to arrive to from this kind of reasoning, that the parts of the ship are all that matters, and that to say that the ship number 1 is the Ship of Theseus is to negate that. And alternatively, we could say that no, ship number 1 is actually the real Ship of Theseus. So ship number 2 is not the Ship of Theseus, it's just a new ship that happens to be made of pieces of wood that used to compose the old ship, ship number 1. So ship number 2 is not the Ship of Theseus, it's just a completely different ship. The parts here aren't what matters, it's the collective, right? The collective. The idea that the ship is simply something that has gradually been replaced doesn't change the fact that it's the same ship. We're still talking about an individual ship, just different pieces. Wow, more diamonds, awesome. Now, to say that ship number 1 is the true Ship of Theseus because the collective is all that matters and not the parts of the ship does at first seem to make more sense, but it also leads us to some problematic conclusions. What this means essentially is that the parts are inconsequential. The ship is a collective being, right? The ship is a thing made up of things, but the big thing, let's say, which is the ship, is not the same thing as the little things, aka, let's say, the pieces of wood that make up the ship. And so the pieces of wood aren't what define the ship. The ship is defined by itself. Which leads us to think about, what do the parts even mean then? Do the parts of the ship even matter? Do the parts of the ship represent anything specific? And we get to other ideas. I mean, does this mean that the ship is not even one thing? I mean, what you will have noticed here is that we're consistently questioning what the ship even is. Is the ship the whole? Is the ship the parts? What parts exactly? And to what extent are the parts of the ship the ship? What is a ship, really? What is a collective? If we accept that ship number 1 is the true Ship of Theseus, despite the fact that all of its parts have changed, does that mean that different pieces of wood at different times would be the Ship of Theseus? For example, if the new wood that will one day be used to fix the Ship of Theseus and be a new part of the Ship of Theseus, if that wood is still to be harvested one day from a tree, should we consider that the tree is part of the Ship of Theseus, but just in the future? And this idea of different pieces of wood being the ship at different times brings us to another potential conclusion, which is that the ship is actually both ships. Ship 1 and 2 both have a potential claim to being the Ship of Theseus, because it can clearly be said that both the whole and the parts of the ship matter. And in that case, we can't really conclude for sure which one is the Ship of Theseus. In fact, both may be partially the Ship of Theseus. Why? Well, because the parts are changed. The new parts still make up the original collective, let's say, but the old parts are still the parts that were and always have been a part of the real thing, of the actual ship. Thus, they have an equal claim to be considered as the ship. If the ship is simply the collective made up of the parts, then the parts play no role, then that's absurd, because if the parts play no role, then there's nothing. There's nothing. The ship is entirely made up of parts. And so if the parts play no role, then, well, there's no ship. Which means that the ship is little more than the space occupied by the pieces of wood. And so the space is arbitrary. The space can be the entire space occupied by the majority of the pieces of wood at a specific time, and when they're changed, the space remains the same. But because it's the parts that actually occupy the space, then we could simply say that, in fact, the space occupied by the parts when they change places and become a part of Ship 2 are the Ship of Theseus. Which again brings us to the possibility of both being the ship. Because, I mean, what is the ship? What, is it the collective? Is it the pieces of the collective? Is it the collective made by the new pieces? Or the old pieces? Like, it's so difficult to tell. Yeah, I'm playing on normal. This shouldn't be this hard. What's happening? But basically, what this other idea of both ships being the Ship of Theseus potentially would lead us to is to believe that the Ship of Theseus is in fact not a ship, but two ships. Two ships. This is if you want to, I guess, really be really provocative with your reasoning, that there are in fact two ships of Theseus, both occupying the same spot at once. One being the collective, which is the actual space occupied by, well, I guess the collective, and then the space occupied by the pieces. And then when they both change spots, then you now have them both essentially having separated, like, you know, they would normally. Like you would expect them to normally. They're both the ship, and you now have two ships. And while they both used to occupy the same space, since the old parts were part of the old ship, now they both occupy different spaces, and so both are the Ship of Theseus, and yet neither is the complete Ship of Theseus, you could say. Then there's the potential to say that, in fact, neither of them are the Ship of Theseus. They have both been changed fundamentally. The parts have all gone their separate ways. They've been assembled in a completely different way. Even if it's all the same parts that have been assembled together, they've been completely reassembled. And as for the old ship, it's made up of completely different things. To say that they're both the Ship of Theseus, that either of them really is the Ship of Theseus, is to reject the notion that both of them have changed on a very fundamental level, which they have. Thus, to say that either of them is the ship is to reject this, which would be ridiculous. Basically, neither of them is the Ship of Theseus anymore. They have both changed far too much. They have evolved into something different, you could say. Something that is not the Ship of Theseus. Something that is completely different from the Ship of Theseus that they both used to be. Both the parts and the whole. Thus, the Ship of Theseus, in effect, no longer really exists. But the way the Ship of Theseus is really looked at nowadays is as a sort of allegory for human nature, you could say. You, as a human being, how much can you say that you have changed, and how much can we say that the new version of you is you? So one could say that your cells are an integral part of your existence. But of course, we all still consider ourselves as ourselves, even though our cells die and regenerate every single day. The fact that your cells regenerate every single day doesn't mean that you have disappeared and been reborn every single day. You could look at it that way, but I mean, we don't really look at it that way because it doesn't feel logical. But where it's a lot more interesting is mentally. Are you mentally the same person as you were 10 years ago? Right? It seems like a ridiculous question. But where it might be really interesting is with people who have, let's say, gone through very traumatic experiences. Let's say someone who's been through a war, right? People who have gone through war tend to see things that, you know, normal people never really see. They tend to start to not really be the same as they used to be. So people who knew them in the past might not necessarily recognize them because they're just such different people. Bye. Goodbye. Thank you for the slime balls. So someone who has gone through such a traumatic experience, right? These kinds of experiences can change you so much. You can just become a completely different person. You know, the trauma, the new outlook on what life really is, and seeing people, for example, die in battle and all that, it could really leave you a changed person, completely changed. And so, can you really say that you're a person who has perhaps changed a little bit, or that you're a complete different person, which is definitely plausible considering the magnitude of the experiences that you would have gone through. If you want something, I guess, more understandable or more accessible to most of us, think about it this way. Have you ever been to your relatives, relatives that you haven't seen in a very, very long time, and they look at you and they're like, man, look how much you've grown. Last time I saw you, you were this tall, and like you saw them 10 years ago. Last time they saw you were like 5 years old or something, and now you're 15. And so to them, you're completely different. They've never really seen you before. They've seen you before technically, but and you probably still look the same to a significant degree. But you've also changed so much. You're so much bigger, so much taller, and mentally speaking, you're probably a completely different person than when you were, 5 years old. Naturally, I should certainly hope you are. It's something like that. I mean, you can't say that you're the same person you are now as you were when you were 5 years old. It's just ridiculous. Or can you? Can you say that you're just the same person but who's evolved through the experiences you've been through and that these experiences are a part of you? Or is it more correct to say that the experiences you've been through have been so diverse that one simply can't say that you're the same person at all? Because you just changed far too much. So I feel that's what's really interesting about thinking about the Ship of Theseus, because if we look at it as simply an example of what human nature is like, and what we as human beings are like, and what we, when we change, become, it's very interesting to think about. But again, we don't really know. Just like with the Ship of Theseus, really. I mean, we're never really gonna know for sure, is the Ship of Theseus actually just ship number one, or is it ship number two? Is it both? Is it neither? Or is there some other fifth answer, perhaps, that we haven't really thought about? At the end of the day, none of these questions are easy. Nonetheless, it's always interesting to ask them. Anyway, I hope you found this video enjoyable and understandable, even if the whole philosophical concept of the Ship of Theseus is perhaps a little complicated to wrap your head around. I certainly find it very enjoyable to ask myself these kinds of questions because they're important to who we are as human beings. And of course, we may not find an answer, but, well, thinking about them is what will perhaps lead us to an answer. Isn't this fun? You could just play the game with a shield, really. Imagine needing a sword to actually win. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope to see you next time, hopefully. Maybe not in a cave.